The night my mother grabbed a wine glass from the table and tapped it with a fork to get the room's attention, I already knew something was coming. I had felt it the moment I walked into the Caruso Club in Sudbury. Seen it in the way she smiled at me from across the banquet room. That specific smile, the one that always had a little too much teeth in it. She was giving a toast. Matthew and Amber had gotten engaged 3 weeks earlier, and this was the celebration dinner. 50-something people crammed into a hall with a photo booth in the corner, and a charcuterie spread that probably cost more than my first year's rent in Toronto. My brother was glowing. Amber was glowing. The whole room had that particular warmth that comes with open bar and good news. And then my mother stood up. She talked about Matthew first. Of course she did. She talked about how hard he'd worked, how he'd pushed through every injury, how even when the hockey didn't go the way they'd hoped, he'd rebuilt himself in insurance and made something solid. Her voice got thick at the edges when she talked about him, the way it only ever did for Matthew. Then she looked at me. "And our Claudine is here too," she said. The room shifted. You could feel it. That small collective adjustment when a crowd realizes something uncomfortable is about to happen. Claudine is in Toronto doing her freelance thing. Graphic design, websites, something like that. She laughed, and a few people laughed with her. The kind of laugh that's really just an exhale of relief that the joke isn't aimed at you. We're never quite sure what she's up to, but we love her. She's still figuring it out. She lifted her glass toward me like it was a gift. I smiled. I kept my hands flat on the table. I counted my own heartbeats because it was something to do. But before I tell you what happened next, what I said, what the room did, and what I found out 48 hours later that reframed everything, I need to take you back. Because my mother's toast didn't come out of nowhere. It came from 22 years of the same story, told so many times that I think even she forgot she was the one who had written it. We grew up in Sudbury. Northern Ontario, nickel country, the kind of city that people from Southern Ontario make jokes about, until they actually drive up and find out. It's beautiful in ways that don't photograph well. My father worked at the Clarabelle Mill, the Vale operation, and he was the person who made our house feel like a home. When I was 13, he had a stroke. He was 41 years old. He survived, but he didn't come back to himself the same way, and he passed 2 years later. After that, it was just my mother, Matthew, and me. And Matthew's hockey. Matthew was good, genuinely good. Not good enough to make the OHL, as it turned out, but good enough that you could understand why people believed he might. My mother built her whole second chapter around that belief. She drove him to early morning practices in Chelmsford, and late afternoon sessions in Lively. She bought the custom skates and the extra tape and the protein powder that cost $35 a bag. She kept a binder of his statistics. I kept my grades up and mostly stayed out of the way. When I was 17, I was accepted to OCAD University in Toronto, the Ontario College of Art and Design. Graphic communication design. It was the only thing I'd ever wanted to study, the only program I'd applied to. My father, the version of him that existed before the stroke took the best of him, used to sit with me while I drew at the kitchen table and tell me I had an eye for things. I applied to OCAD because of him. The acceptance letter came in March. I brought it to my mother on a Tuesday evening, while she was going over Matthew's tournament's schedule for the spring. She looked at it for a long time. Then she set it down. "Claudine," she said, "OCAD is expensive. And OSAP only covers so much, we just don't have the gap right now." I asked how much of a gap. She said maybe $12,000 a year, maybe more. She said maybe I could defer, work, save up. She said maybe things would look different in a year. What I didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table with my acceptance letter face down on the placemat, was that 3 months earlier my mother had signed an agreement for $38,000 with the Northern Elite Hockey Academy in Barrie. A full residential training season for Matthew, elite coaching, tournament travel, branded gear with his name on the back. She'd taken out a personal line of credit to cover it. I deferred OCAD, then I deferred again. Then I stopped deferring and started calling it something else. I moved to Toronto the summer I turned 20. I had $2,200 in a savings account from 2 years of waitressing on Elgin Street and a mattress I'd gotten off Kijiji that I tied to the roof of a borrowed Civic. My apartment was a basement unit in Parkdale, with a ceiling that sweated in August and a landlord who was never available and always watching. Rent was $940 a month, which in 2015 felt like everything. I got a job at a print and signage shop in Kensington Market, making $14.50 an hour cutting vinyl and running plotter prints for other people's businesses. At night, I taught myself everything I couldn't afford to learn in a classroom. Typeface theory, color systems, user experience design. There were forums, YouTube channels, free Coursera modules, Slack communities full of working designers who answered questions from strangers at midnight like it was a calling. I took every free resource I could find. I practiced on real things, redesigned the menus for a roti shop on Queen West for free, just to have something in my portfolio, rebuilt the website for a pottery studio in Leslieville, in exchange for a wheel-throwing class I never actually used. By 23, I had enough of a portfolio to start taking on paying clients. Small ones. A hair salon in the Junction, an accountant in Etobicoke, a food truck collective that needed a full brand identity from scratch. I was charging $2,000 for projects that took me 2 weeks, and I was booked 3 months out, and something in me started to quietly understand what that meant. At 25, I incorporated. I called it Clearline Studio, just me, a subcontracted illustrator I'd met at a design meetup in the Distillery District, and a desk I rented from a shared office space in Liberty Village. I kept my own name completely off the public-facing materials. No LinkedIn profile, no press releases. All inquiries ran through a general contact email, and through a business lawyer named Helena, who was precise and unflappable and asked very few questions. Why the secrecy? Because I understood how my family operated well enough to know what happened when they learned you were building something. I had watched them take small bites of my father's confidence, for years, help themselves to it the way people help themselves to something they don't think anyone is counting. He'd had ideas once. They'd all been subtly discouraged until he stopped having them. I wasn't making the same offer. By 28, Clearline had 6 full-time employees, a proper lease in the West Queen West Design District, and a client list that included 2 national retail brands, and a growing stream of referrals from people who found out we delivered what we promised us, on time and on budget, which in the design industry is apparently considered remarkable. Annual revenue had crossed $1.9 million. I had a condo in Roncesvalles with exposed brick and a window where I could see the CN Tower on clear days. I wore what I'd earned. I asked nobody for anything. And then Matthew called to tell me he was engaged to Amber Kowalski. I knew the Kowalski name. Amber's family owned Kowalski Building Supply, a Northern Ontario chain with 12 locations from Sudbury to Sault Ste. Marie. 3 years earlier, they had come to Clearline through a referral for a complete brand overhaul, new logo, new signage system, new website, new trade show materials, a full identity refresh across every customer touchpoint. The project had taken 7 months and invoiced at just over $212,000. It was, at the time, our largest single contract. I had never met the Kowalski family in person. Everything had run through a project manager on their end and our account lead on ours. Deliverables went to an email address. Checks came from accounts payable. I had no reason to connect a building supply chain in Northern Ontario to my brother's personal life. And even less reason to make the connection once I learned he'd met Amber at a curling bonspiel in North Bay. I found out about all of this from Aunt Colette, my father's older sister, who still lives in the house on Paris Street where my dad grew up, and who texts me long voice memos from her iPad when she has news she thinks I should know about. Aunt Colette was the one who called me the morning before the engagement party. "Claudine," she said, "I have to tell you something. Your mother has been telling Amber's family that you work at a design agency, that you have a junior position somewhere. She said you're doing well enough, but it's not really a career. You know how she talks." I thanked Aunt Colette. I told her I'd be fine. I went to that party because Matthew asked me to come, and because my brother, whatever else is true, has never been cruel to me on purpose. He loves me the way people love things they've never had to think carefully about. It's genuine. It's just never been examined. I wore a dark green wrap dress I'd bought myself, my grandmother's silver earrings, my father's mother's. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman who had been building something real in the quiet and who knew it. The Caruso Club, Sudbury, October. White roses in narrow vases on every table. The smell of garlic bread and something slow roasted. Amber's family filled one side of the room, and my mother's side filled the other, and I sat, somewhere in the middle at a table, with 2 of Matthew's old hockey teammates, and their partners who were perfectly nice, and had no idea who I was. Amber's father, George, gave the first toast. He was warm, generous, the kind of man who makes a room feel more settled just by standing in it. He talked about Amber with straightforward pride that didn't embarrass anyone. Then he mentioned, almost as an aside, that the family business had recently completed a brand refresh. "I don't know if you've noticed any of our stores," he said, laughing a little, "but we finally look like we know what we're doing. Some incredible studio out of Toronto did the work. Honestly, I'd trust them with anything." I looked at my wine glass. Then my mother stood up. She talked about Matthew's resilience, his pivot from hockey to a career in insurance, his determination. She talked about Amber with an enthusiasm that had been assembled over 3 weeks rather than grown over years. But it was genuine enough. And then she looked across the room and found me the way she always finds me in a crowd. Not warmly, but the way a person notices a water stain on a ceiling. And Claudine is here, Matthew's little sister, she said. The room turned. Claudine is in Toronto. She does some design work, freelance, a bit of this and that. She's always been the creative one. She smiled. 31 and still kind of winging it, but that's our Claudine. We love her anyway. Two people near the back laughed. The rest of the room went quiet in the particular way. That means everyone has decided to pretend nothing happened. I sat very still. I put my hands flat on my thighs. I gave myself 10 seconds. Then I stood up. Someone at the table beside me handed me a microphone before I even reached for one. I think they just wanted something to do. I'd like to say something, I said. My voice came out even. I want you to understand that. It was completely even. Matthew, Amber, I love you both and I mean that. I looked at my brother. He was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since we were children. Careful, very still. And I want to say something to everyone here. Because my mother just told you I'm winging it. So let me tell you where I actually am. I turned toward George Kowalski. The studio that did your brand refresh, the one you mentioned in your toast just now. That's my company, Clearline Studio. I founded it 6 years ago. I own it. We have 9 employees, just under $2 million in annual revenue. And the project your family hired us for is work I'm genuinely proud of. The room did not make a sound. George Kowalski looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at his daughter. Then he looked at my mother. I turned to her. Mom, I didn't go to OCAD because you told me we couldn't cover the gap. We could have. You spent that money on Matthew's hockey academy in Barrie. I kept my voice level. My hands were still. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because I have spent 11 years being the cautionary tale in your version of this family. And I am not that. I never was. I set the microphone down on the table. I picked up my bag. I walked toward the coat check. My heels on the polished floor were the only sound in the room. I sat in my rental car on Paris Street for almost an hour. Not crying. Just breathing. The way you breathe when something has finally been said out loud, that has been living only in your chest for a decade. Let me step out of the story for a moment and speak directly to you. If you have ever been the sibling at the far table, the one the toasts don't quite reach, the one described as still figuring it out, while your actual life quietly contradicts everything they believe about you. This is for you. If you've ever swallowed a correction 100 times because you didn't want to make a scene, and then one day realized the scene was already being made, just not by you. I see you. Drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever had to say the true thing in a room that had already agreed on a lie? I read every single one. Now, back to the story. Because what happened 2 days after that party is what reframed everything. Not just what my mother had done, but how far back it went. Aunt Colette called me on a Thursday morning, while I was on my balcony in Roncesvalles, with my second coffee. Claudine, she said. There's something I should have told you years ago. I've carried it and I'm sorry I waited. My grandmother, my father's mother, who we called Grandmom in Fortin, had died when I was 21. She'd lived her whole life in Sudbury and saved everything she had in careful, quiet increments. Before she passed, she had set aside a designated savings account, just over $32,000, with a written instruction through her estate that it was specifically for my education or professional development. The letter had been addressed to me. My mother had signed for it. She had told my grandmother's estate executor that I had decided not to pursue any further schooling and would not be using the funds. The account had been absorbed into the general estate and redirected to a joint account my mother controlled. I went still in a way that was different from the stillness at the engagement party. Colder, more complete. I called Helena that afternoon. It took her firm 2 weeks and one formal written inquiry to the estate's financial institution to recover the money. $31,200, the principal plus partial accumulated returns. Grandmam in Fortin had been meticulous. Her estate paperwork was carefully maintained. The records still existed. My mother had not considered that they might. I chose not to pursue it further through the courts. I made that decision deliberately, and I've made peace with it. Some things cost more than the satisfaction of winning them, and I had already spent too much of my life in a posture that was organized around her. What I did instead was donate the full $31,200 to the OCAD University Foundation's bursary program for first-generation students from Northern Ontario communities, in Grandmam in Fortin's name. It was the most useful and the most honest thing I could think to do with it. 6 weeks after the engagement party, Matthew called me. He had found out about Clearline through Amber, who had found out through her father. George Kowalski had put the pieces together quietly over dinner one evening and told his daughter. Amber had told Matthew, and Matthew had apparently sat with it for several days before he picked up his phone. He was quiet for a long time on the call. Then he said, Claudine, I didn't know about the hockey academy money. I knew you didn't go to OCAD, but I always thought you'd just chosen differently. I didn't know. I know you didn't. And Grandmamon's savings. He stopped. His voice had something in it I hadn't heard before, something that sat close to shame. I didn't know about that either. I know, Matthew. We talked for almost 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had in our lives. He cried at one point, which surprised me and then didn't. He's not a bad person, my brother. He's a person who was handed a particular story, and never questioned it because the story was comfortable and it was about him. Most people would do exactly the same thing. We're still working out what a real relationship between us looks like. It's uncertain. It's real. That's more than we've ever had before, and I'll take it. My mother has not contacted me directly. Through Matthew, I've heard she's telling people I planned the whole thing, that it was calculated and cruel, that I chose an engagement party to make my point, because I wanted to cause damage. I've sat with that seriously. Here's what I know. I spent 11 years being quiet about the truth, because I believed that if I built something undeniable, the narrative would eventually correct itself. It doesn't work that way. The narrative does not correct itself. You have to say the true thing out loud. Sometimes you have to say it in a room full of people who would prefer not to hear it. That does not make you the person who created the problem. Today, Clearline Studio has 11 employees. We just signed a new contract with a community arts organization in Scarborough that I'm more excited about than anything we've taken on in over a year. I have a therapist, Dr. Anisha Chowdhury, who I see every other Thursday in a quiet office near Bloor and Spadina, and who said something to me last month that I haven't stopped turning over. She said, "The loneliest grief is the kind you carry for a parent who is still alive." She's right. I keep a photograph of Grandmamon Fortin on my desk. She's sitting on the porch of the Paris Street house with a cup of tea, looking off to the side like something quietly amusing has just happened out of frame. She has her hands resting loosely in her lap, the way my father used to hold his, like they weren't worried. "Grandmamon, I did it," I kept going. "I am not angry at my family. I want to be clear about that. Anger is expensive, and I've been paying other people's bills my whole life. What I have in its place took me a long time to recognize as its own kind of freedom, clarity, about who I am, what I built, and what I deserve. About the kind of people I let close, and the kind I hold at a certain honest distance. Setting a boundary isn't a punishment. It's not a wall. It's just a true statement about what you need in order to remain yourself. If you are watching this from a family that made you feel like a footnote, hear me. You are the whole story. You always were. They were just never reading it carefully enough. Thank you for being here. If any part of this stayed with you, please subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me your story. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And remember this, you are not what they decided you were. You never were. You are so much more than that. Until next time, this is Claudine and I am finally home.